Hello and welcome to this episode of Talking Trim. Today we're looking at a set of fully trimmed front seats for the Triumph TR2. A few things to mention about the TR2 seats and the seat frames before we dive into it. Originally, the majority of the TR2s left with two fixed seat frames, both for the driver and passenger side, and this is the case for this example here, i.e. the backrests do not tilt or tip forward. That was introduced for the majority of the TR3 onward models, so just bear that in mind. These are original frames that the customer has sent in, and he's reconditioned them before sending them in, and then we've retrimmed them using new seat covers, new seat foams, seat tacking strips, but he's actually sent us some seat springs for us to use. They happen to be some that my father supplied back in the 1990s, but they remain unused. A little bit rusty on the actual spring side of it, but nothing untoward, and the firmness of them are absolutely fine, so we agreed with the client that there's absolutely no reason to replace them just for the sake of it. Then we've retrimmed them. It's also worth noting for the TR2 seats, originally the piping was the same colour as the main trim. As you can see on these seats, we've contrasted. We've gone parchment with British racing green at the customer's request, but for TR2s normally it was matching piping. You can see we've obviously contrasted the piping on the inside and the outside, and that is because the seat styling between the TR2s and the TR3s was so similar, and the TR3s always had white piping on the inside and outside. So for us, it makes obvious sense that if you're going to contrast with an alternate colour for TR2s, that you should follow that same spectrum and go inside and outside on that. Generally speaking, any other seats in the Triumph range after that, we don't really recommend that. We only recommend going on the outside, but we can discuss that on an ad hoc basis when you place an order, so that's not a problem. While we're also on the styling elements of the TR2 seats, it's worth noting that we have the correct patterns for the TR2, and not many people do. A lot of people think that the TR2 and the TR3 are exactly the same in terms of the styling of the seat cover, and they're not. They're very similar, and you could get them to interchange and work in terms of the frameworks, foams, etc., but they are different. The main difference being this gap here in the horseshoe on the cushion base. On the TR2 it was narrower, and the piping on the outside sat on the ridge of the spring unit. However, on the TR3s, you notice that it actually dips down, and it goes down here below the level of the ridge and comes back up. So this whole gap here is wider. It's a subtle difference, but it's noticeable, and the reason for that presumably is a comfort one. If you imagine the piping on the TR2s kind of sat in the back of your knee, and therefore could be seen as a little bit uncomfortable and perhaps harder wearing on the piping over the course of time, and so Triumph made the change. And so it's just worth noting that that's the level of detail that we go to on these seats. We have the original patterns for all of the seats there, and so we do know the differences. There are a lot of suppliers out there that will make you believe that the TR2 and TR3 seats are exactly the same as one another, but they are not. Anyway, diving into these ones here. Parchment with British racing green piping. It's leather face spec. Leather face meaning that the bits that touch your body are leather and the backs and the surrounds are vinyl. So for example, on the cushion base, this horseshoe and this pleated panel are leather, and on the backrest, the horseshoe and the pleated panel are leather. Whereas the vinyl is used for the surround of the cushion base, as well as the retainer here, and then on the backrest, same again. The retainer here is vinyl that you can barely see. The backrest backs are vinyl, and then the frame surround there is also vinyl. We can offer three spectrums of material for the seat covers. We can do everything in vinyl at one end of the spectrum, everything in leather at the other end of the spectrum, or we have this in-between option here, which was leather faced. It's worth noting a lot of TR2s did leave with leather face as the original spec, often referred to as leather on the heritage certificate, so it can be a bit confusing, and a bit more confusing out there as well. And many manufacturers refer to leather faced as leather, not to be confused with our full leather option, so just bear that in mind. Yeah, trim them up. They're fairly straightforward to trim up. You've got to make sure obviously that the pleats match up nicely. Only got 4 pleats on these, so not the hardest thing in the world. We do recommend actually you start with the backrest, because the backrests are trickier, and it means that it's harder to move the pleat direction once they are trimmed, whereas the cushions are a bit easier to move the pleat, so you can get them to line up a bit easier. They are tight fitting covers on the backrest. You need to make sure that the piping stays roughly on the circumference of that. So see our other videos for the way you set up the foams and things like that, and we will be doing a handbook blog post on the best ways of trimming these things. Then you can see the ridge on the backrest here where the cushion base sits in, so it does sit quite high up in there, so you've got a lot to play with. And you use tacking strips going around the base surround here. You can just about make them out there. And then also on the underside there, you have tacking strips to tack to. Tacking strips are great because they're interchangeable. You can anchor, switch and move, whereas glue can be a bit messier and harder to do that. The cushion bases, obviously it's on springs. We have you can see the black calico scrim material, which allows you to alter the height of the spring to whatever depth you want in the car. And then effectively you're using hog rings to trim it to the spring. That's the best way of doing it. You need a hog ring gun though, bear that in mind. It's worth noting you can use cable ties if you don't have a hog ring gun, but it's worth investing in a hog ring gun. It does make life a bit easier. Yeah, that's kind of about it really, I think. Nicely trimmed up seats. Like I say, we can offer more help and advice to you or your trimmer should you need it. Or if you want to send us your seat frames, we can just do the work for you, ready to go into the car. So thanks for tuning in. Please remember to like, subscribe and share with other classic car enthusiasts. Till next time.